So my project is on price floors and ceilings. The first important thing to understand when you're learning about price floors and ceilings is the basics. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about those. So right here I have a supply and demand graph. And on this graph we have the x-axis being quantity demanded by the consumers to be bought. And on the y-axis we have price. And that's the price that the good is sold for. This is all for one individual good. The first thing you need to recognize here is that there's a demand curve, which is this one labeled D, and it's downward sloping. And we have a supply curve, and that's the one labeled S, and that's upward sloping. So a demand curve, all along this demand curve are points. And each of those points can be known as quantity demanded. So for example, this point, we have a really high price for the good, and because of that, consumers aren't going to demand a large amount of it, and that could be represented as an ordered pair. And then down here, we could have a really low price good, but we can have a really high demand from consumers. And that's quantity demanded, which is an individual point, rather than just demand, which is this whole curve. And sometimes it really is a curve. In real life, this tends to have a more complex shape than this just this straight line in this theoretical example. Supply is the same way in that it has supply and quantity supplied. And probably the most important thing on this graph to recognize at this point is this singular point where both supply and demand lines intersect, and that's known as the equilibrium point. And this equilibrium point is when quantity supplied exactly matches quantity demanded. And that's what tells us this point is what the free market is going to sell our good at. So that's going to be the price and quantity that is sold. We have all these different potentials for production, for supply. We have all these different potential demands from customers. But what's actually going to happen, theoretically at least, is what this equilibrium point showed us. Finally, we have this right here, this term, ceteris paribus, and what this tells us, this is something important that we have to keep in mind when we look at graphs like that, and that is that when we evaluate an economics change, a shift in either supply, demand, or something else, we only let one variable change at a time. So it's really important to make sure, for us to be able to attribute cause and effect, we have to know that only one thing changed. There wasn't a huge spike in unemployment, and consumer taste shifted, just one or the other happened. So one thing that can happen when we accidentally drift away from equilibrium due to outside forces is a shortage. And here I have written, at heart, a shortage occurs when production doesn't match demand. So this means that demand outstrips production. There's more people who want something than production can reasonably satisfy. And what comes first to mind for most people are these terrible, terrible shortages like food shortages. I have an image here of what you sort of think of when you hear the word shortage, and housing shortages. And one thing I thought would be kind of interesting to point out is for consumers, at least, there do exist some sort of good shortages in a way. So there's actually a huge shortage in the cybersecurity field right now where there's not enough professionals to match demand. And I just found that interesting because that means that for consumers, it's actually going to be a good thing because salaries are going to increase. But so surpluses. Surpluses are actually the opposite of shortages. And at heart, a surplus is a supply of goods that demand can't keep up with. So this is when we are producing too much of a certain good and there's actually not enough consumers willing to pay for it. And a price floor, let's start there, is an artificial limitation on price so that it can't fall any further. So in case of the shortage situation we were talking about earlier, the price floor would prevent that because it means that price can't fall any further. So your corn per ton price or whatever you're selling can only become so cheap so that producers still make enough money to remain viable in the market. And this money has to come from somewhere. It comes from the government through whatever source of revenue they take it out of, either taxes or something else. But in the end, it can mean stabilizing an inherently unstable situation, so that can be a good thing. Price ceilings actually do the complete opposite. They limit the maximum price on a good, and that's actually usually more to protect consumers than producers. So let's look at basically a little mini case study. Rent controls are an example of a price ceiling. And rent controls, as we can see here, are imposed in just a couple states, but they're areas where you have a large influx of people, like either San Diego, Los Angeles, New York, who want to live in an area, but there's simply not the supply of houses. So what the free market indicates is that price should rise, but what happens is price rises up and up and up and up to a level that's simply not feasible for most people. So if the free market was allowed to let equilibrium rise, then this would mean that eventually these places wouldn't be affordable for anyone. You'd either have the ultra rich or you'd have mass waves of people moving out. So instead, a controversial solution is to impose a rent control, which is a maximum amount that tenants pay for where they live. And this has limited effectiveness because supply is still limited. So in the end, this can mean that there's less places for people to live in, but it is a solution that is used in certain places. Another little mini case study here is minimum wage. And minimum wage is the opposite, it's a price floor. And finally, I have my sources I use for this presentation. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.